The problem with the web is inline graphics, and then obviously in more recent years, JavaScript. Everything's inline, so a minimalist web browser is impossible in any true function. And the web is not designed, the modern web is designed to be anti that. Whereas the first web was closer to Gopher, which I want to make clear, I'm not actually huge advocates of the early web. I don't think that the web was ever good. What I will say is that the first intention of the web, design-wise, was better than what we got. And the separation of image and text was good. And I think actually this was probably where it was, well, actually it's kind of a false, it's like a distinction without a difference, meaning. So when I said about you would open a separate window, when you say clicked on a link, it would open the image separately. You didn't have inline images, for example. Gopher's basically the same. So on Gopher, you can download files and images from basically a link, right? And then all you do, because it's Unix, if you're using Unix system, you could just either automate it, or you could just, have a split screen. And if you want to view that image, you just, view the image in MPV or something, or, Now, the thing is, like, if you said this to a normal person, they think you're crazy. But the thing is, it's like, what is it? Like Winston Churchill said, the victors write the history. And the history is that that's the way you do things. You use, use what the web has become, not what it should have been. Day one, right? So that's why they feel it's completely normal. This is sort of why I don't think everybody having the use of a computer is a good thing. I'm not saying that like, oh, ban computers for certain people. What I'm saying is that until user interfaces came along, or graphical user interfaces, for most people, it was a steep learning curve. And for companies, it wasn't seen as a obvious way to target people for advertising and selling. And unfortunately, these two have like inextricably linked in the 1980s and then particularly 1990s with the web. And this marriage made in hell means that that really there's no user benefit. It's just a consumer benefit. The user becomes a consumer because the majority of users want to be consumers. The majority of users want to use their computer to buy things. And they want to do that as easily as possible. And a lot of people say, well, that's fantastic. Hey, the democratization of the web, the democratization of computers. But I'm not saying ban computers or ban the web. I'm just saying I wouldn't see it as a bad thing if a lot of people didn't have a computer, had never got one, or if these user interfaces were never made or developed slowly, or were developed in a way that weren't to the benefit of corporations or to companies, but were more of a benefit to the user, gave the user more control. And that everyone else, like, we don't need that, we'll just get on with our lives. I don't see it as a bad thing. I would love to come back to text-only websites. That is why I like Gemini Protocol. Yeah, the thing with that Gemini Protocol is, they made a big thing about it 5 years ago, but it's like Gopher. It's just not going to... Again, I guess this sounds like a contradiction, because what I've said is, well, I'm not, I don't see it as a problem that, not everybody's using it. And of course, not everybody's using Gemini. So what's the problem, right? People who are in the know use Gemini or use Gopher. But the sad, tragic truth is, I don't know how it is with Gemini specifically. I haven't really looked too much into. I have got like a web browser installed that handles Gemini or whatever. But there is also a point where nobody's really using it. And Gopher, I look at the indexes of Gopher sites. I don't know. It just seems like a barren wasteland. Maybe that sort of contradicts what I've been saying, but I don't know. And again, I'm not a huge advocate of Gopher in a sense. I have to explain it. I think it makes sense. I think Gopher makes sense. And here's what I mean. So if you look at Gopher, if you look at the history of Gopher, Gopher was bigger than the web for those first few years. They basically were made around the same time, right? Gopher was a lot simpler on the face of it than hyper markup text or HTML, let's say. But Gopher, the university, I can't remember which university, University of Massachusetts or Michigan or whatever, that made the protocol, didn't want to make it open source. And what Tim Berners-Lee realized early on with the web was that when Gopher did that, it was like, wow, that's it. I've got them now, because it meant that the web could overtake Gopher, because, okay, now anybody can, use it or understand the protocol, license it, create web browsers, I guess. There was no licensing issues, right? So the web just took off. And what the web enabled companies to do was sell. What they realized was, and advertise. What they realized was that, okay, now we're in control. We're going to take this over. You're going to be buying stuff from us. You're going to be paying subscriptions to services. We own the space now, and we're going to build a shopping mall. We might chuck in a library at the end of it, but that's the dominant factors. And that was one of the reasons why the US government pushed the internet, or the web, sorry, so hard in those early days. Or let's say the infrastructure for the internet to access the web in those early days was for this commercial thing. And I don't think that's a good thing. A lot of people think this is a good thing. Oh, everybody can, have an e-commerce site and all this. It's like, really? Does everything have to be inextricably linked to selling on the web? Is that its only function? Oh yeah, but there's this side thing where you can get information. So everybody knows how it goes. Everybody knows what the end game is. It's money, right? And if you have no guardrails, or you have no principles or no design decisions that limit the destruction of the internet in its current form, which is the web, really, you get a dystopia, really, that's getting worse by the minute, because these companies that make billions already are so desperate to take over your computer, to sell you things, to have you to subscribe to things, that, again, you're not a user, right? You're a consumer. I know it sounds like some sort of cliche communist type, but it's really not. It's just, this is what it is. I'm not anti-business. I'm not anti-buying things. What I'm anti is the web and computers are driven by selling you things. The design is driven to sell you things. There's no user control. If the user has control, that's something. The user probably won't exercise control, which is worrying. And that's why people buy computers, because they don't really care. but that's just what it is. So there's nothing wrong with literal e-commerce. There's nothing wrong with business. The issue is that the web is only designed for that by definition. Look at those look at the 1990s and the history of the web. Look at what they talk about. They talk about commerce. That's what it's all about. They're not interested in giving the user options. Sure, there was all those notions about, oh, you know, a free internet, but it's really all that meant was that, hey, you turn up to the shopping mall, right? You turn up to the shopping center. Now, Gopher, on the face of it, are like, you've got to pay a fee. Here you go. You can come in to the Gopher store, but you've got to pay a fee. What the web basically said, because it was all free and open source software, was like, hey, no, come around, look at all of our shops. Look at this shop face, look at that shop face. See anything you like, want to buy? Oh yeah, but if you carry on down the end, if you really want some user information, or you really want to have free information, yeah, we've got something a little tucked in there, but we're going to make sure the algorithm feeds you all the sales stuff. All the adverts on television and be about selling you stuff, you know. And the only thing with Gemini, I haven't really covered Gemini. The only thing with Gemini, it did seem to be also sort of hinting at, oh no, we want like inline images and stuff like this, which again, so if Gemini, say if Gopher won, right? Say in the early 90s, Gopher made all of their thing open source, and Gopher was like the de facto standard for interacting with the internet. Okay, you had Gopher pages everywhere. The web was like this little thing. The web had made itself proprietary, or the code wasn't free. They never really developed their protocol above, you know, HTTP1, whatever, or they kept it minimal, whatever. And then they, you know, did what Gopher did years later and said, oh no, now it's all open. It would have been too late for HTTP, right? Possibly. Because what would have happened is Gopher would have done exactly the same thing. The Gopher protocol was obviously kind of less elaborate than HTTP and HTML and all this kind of stuff. But it would have been the same thing, because it would have been like, companies are going to push for development. Now we need pictures in line. Now we need this. I can just see the same thing happening. Web browsers or Gopher browsers would have been more elaborate. Exactly the same thing would have happened what happened to HTML, HTTP and the web. It's just that HTTP and the web won, right? And Gemini would have been the same. But Gemini, I don't know. I'm not necessarily a fan of Gemini, but obviously it's probably better than the web. But how many people are using Gemini, I don't know. Maybe I should have a look sometime.